Регламент обычный: вначале будет выступление Майкла Гордина, потом попросила слово Олеся Игоревна Кирчик, это будет своего рода оппонирование, и затем в режиме быстрой дискуссии, ответ-вопрос, можно будет задать вопрос, а потом примерно 5, максимум 7 минут время для выступления, да, и можно пользоваться чатом. Майкл, вам слово.
Okay, спасибо всем. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm very sorry I haven't been able to be with you since November 2019, but I have felt very fortunate this past year to be able to participate in this community, even though at a distance. I was just beginning this project when I first arrived in Moscow, and I'm afraid that due to the pandemic, which has restricted my ability to visit archives in Russia and elsewhere, and also unpleasant administrative obligations during this past year, I've made less progress than I hoped. So this is a work in progress, and that also means I will benefit very much from your suggestions and your thoughts. Please feel free to ask any questions in Russian if you prefer. Мне все равно, тоже можно по-немецки, если хотите. The larger project of which this presentation is a part is a history of what happens to science when the USSR dissolved. The precise timescale of the study is yet to be determined. I am fairly sure I will begin in 1986, and I'm happy to explain why 1986. But I'm uncertain whether the project ends in 2001, 2013, or later. Today, however, I'm going to focus on 3 episodes from the 1990s, which will definitely be included no matter where I end. And this is also only a subset of the topics. I have excluded some of the more science technical ones from that, but I'm happy to discuss what they might be. Given the audience here, which knows the history of the final years of the Soviet Union very well, I'm not going to spend much time describing how science worked in the Soviet Union, but the emphasis will be on what came next. Before I get to my argument, let me explain some of the historiographical background that shapes how I now think about this project. It's obviously a very large topic, and I have to make choices about how to focus. One way one might approach the topic of the end of Soviet science and what comes after is as an episode in the history of the USSR and the Russian Federation. And that is largely the approach of these books. There are not many books written about this topic. There are a few in Russian, there are some in English, in large part because the project is so recent. There are many, many studies that are sociological or political science or policy documents, but I'm talking about historical analyses. Even with the case of the Josephson book here about Alfyorov, I'm cheating a bit. It's mostly not about the post-Soviet period, but there is several chapters that cover the 1990s. In these cases, the history is also being written by people who were deeply involved in the process of the transformations of post-Soviet science. So, and I obviously was not. But the intention I have here is to look at what happened as a series of events that involve science, but that are significant because the intention of all these books is to look at a series of events that happen to involve science, but the reason they are interesting is because they are episodes within Russian history. That is very good as far as it goes, and I could not even begin to do this topic without the work that Graham and Dezhina, for example, did in Science in the New Russia. But I think there's a significant drawback for this approach. Russia is not the same thing as the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union didn't just turn into Russia, as you all know, and Soviet science did not just turn into Russian science. Any history of this topic, to be adequate, has to some degree be transnational. And all of these are to some degree. I hope to push that further. My main objection to the Russian history approach is that I don't think science is among the best ways to provide a fresh approach to the end of the Soviet Union. Rather, I want to follow a different book by Lauren Graham, which is this one. The end of the Soviet Union was a transformative event in the history of global science. And that's how I want to tell it. What does this tell us about how science operates around the globe, not how Russian politics evolves? My argument today is that the way in which science was reformatted after the dissolution of the Soviet Union illustrates three important structural features of global science as it operates in the decades 1990s to today. Each of these developments is intrinsically transnational. And although many of my examples are centered on the Russian Federation, which is after all the largest successor state, and the Russian Soviet Republic contained most of Soviet science, on the order of 80% of science done in the Soviet Union was done in the Russian Soviet Republic, it can never be just a single nation state story. Each of these three stories is preliminary, but I think they're illustrative, and I'm very eager to hear your feedback. I'll begin by looking at how scientific labor moved, both across borders and across different labor markets in the years of perestroika and then after the end of the Soviet Union. The term you'll find all over the literature is this one, brain drain. Every time I bring this topic up about the end of Soviet science with someone, they mention brain drain. It's the first phrase. The term is often found in literature about science to refer specifically really to this moment of the late USSR and the early post-Soviet era. But that's not obviously not the origin of the term. The fact that the term rhymes should tell you one thing already, which is that it's an Anglophone term in origin. In fact, it's very Anglophone. It dates to the 1960s when it described an emigration of British engineers and scientists to the United States. The term came from Britain, and all brain drain discourse is told from the perspective of the nation state that feels it is losing talent, however talent is defined. So brain drain discourses come from the countries that are worried about what's happening to them. It's never the language in which, say, the United States characterizes migration of talent. Even if you ignore the specific term, we have historically, hang on a second. We have historically seen scientific communities collapse before or transform in scale, although not always accompanied by emigration. The most obvious one is that posed by Germany in the 20th century. In this 1999 article, Mitchell Ash made a very helpful observation and comparison. He noted that there are three waves of mass firings of scientists, including in this science as Wissenschaft written broadly, which includes humanists and social scientists, in the 20th century. The first is in 1933, when Jews and socialists are purged from the civil service, and this gets the bulk of the historiographic attention as it is one of the first things the Nazi state does. It's also the only one of these three that produces international migration on a large scale. The second one comes at the end of the war, and this is a purge of Nazi scientists and scholars from the universities. The data is very hard to calculate precisely, given that there are multiple sectors in occupied Germany, Soviet, American, British, and French, which do different things. And then there's Austria, and then other places like Czechoslovakia and Poland, where there are other transformations. Nonetheless, it's, as you can see, a much larger scale. The third one comes in 1989, and it's with the end of the German Democratic Republic. And this is by far the largest. 12,000 scholars are fired. And just in case you think that this is a small, this is because populations have increased, this is actually 39% of the intellectual infrastructure of East Germany. In 1933, about 15% were fired. And that's if you include physicians. Without including physicians, you have 39% of East Germany's knowledge producers are fired. But I show this data here to indicate that we have seen reconstructions of science in the 20th century on a couple of occasions on large-scale transformations. But what we haven't seen is something on this scale in terms of numbers and in terms of extent of what happens at the end of the USSR, both to the USSR itself and to the Soviet bloc more broadly. And that's why this is a distinct episode in the history of science that I think doesn't have a counterpart. This is the term that you'll see in Russian starting to appear in the late 1980s, and it trades assonance for rhyme. In the case of the Soviet Union, you see numbers that are in general much, much larger than the largest German case, both in terms of the number of people and in terms of the percentage they are of the population. So to explain what this graph is, this takes the number of scientific workers as defined in Soviet and then post-Soviet statistics as 100 in 1990, and then looks at how many of them there exist in 95, 2000, 2002, and 2004. So in the case of Azerbaijan at the top, in 2002, for every 100 workers, scientific workers you had in 1990, you have 72 in 2002, which is a 28% contraction. There's no question a very serious phenomenon is happening here. For example, looking at the case of Russia, you'll notice that the drop is over 50% in terms of scientific workers, and it's an effect you see 15 years after the end of the Soviet Union still present. Even in that instance, Russia is not the most extreme case. Armenia is a much more severe case, but it's also not on the low end. It's somewhere in the middle. Even cases like Azerbaijan, which is a fairly mild drop compared to some of these others, is quite severe, on the order of Germany at the end of the Cold War. Interpreting any of this is, however, quite hard for a number of reasons. The first reason is that these numbers are all measured on a baseline of 1990, but we know that some form of external emigration was already happening in the late 1980s, especially of Soviet citizens of Jewish, German, and Greek ancestry, which had been happening earlier. So where this starts is a little lower than peak. And the peak was about 1 million people working in the Soviet scientific infrastructure based on the Soviet definition of a scientific worker. Estimating that number is quite difficult. The best estimate we have is from around 1980. The second point of why these numbers are hard is that the definition of who is in the research and development sector can change. And some of this data is surely based on changing definitions, but we don't know what those are in each case. This affects every graph that you will see about this transitology period, this period of transition, where Russian and foreign specialists try to diagnose the state of affairs in the former Soviet Union using data which is a pretty complicated and not necessarily very clear set of data. To my mind, though, the fundamental issues is that the phenomenon that is measured here is a contraction of a labor market. That's what you see in these figures. That's not the same thing as a brain drain, which is emigration. The Russian scientific labor market shrinks by about 45%. It is probably both worse than that and better than that if you add all the numbers and factors together. And specifying some of the processes will help in figuring out why the discourse of utechka umov, the discourse of brain drain, is so prevalent. So these three phenomena, at least, are all going on. All of the attention is about the one at the top, that is emigration of specialists from the former Soviet Union outward. But this is very hard to measure. Why? First, every country keeps track of different things. The United States, for example, measures what someone took their college degree in when they come into the United States, but they don't care what their labor was when what they were working as before. So as a result, we don't know whether they were a scientist. We just know that they have a degree in mathematics. That doesn't help you very much in figuring out which scientists are leaving. Israel and Germany have different protocols and measure different things. I'm picking these three in that order because Germany sees by far the largest amount of post-Soviet technical specialists emigrating. It also sees the largest amount of post-Soviet emigration, period. Israel is second, the United States is third. The German states have the largest influx, and they're really looking for ethnic heritage because that's what enables the entrance visa, not education or employment. So there are a bunch of scientists in this group, but we can't actually measure it cleanly. Second, while there are scientists leaving Russia for the West, there are also scientists leaving Central Asia, et cetera, for Russia. It's not a huge migration in terms of numbers, but it does tend to be more educated specialists. I've seen no good data which teases out the in-migration as well as the out-migration, but it's clear that it's significant. So when it's all said and done, what's the number? Everybody wants to know the number. The number seems to be 20 to 30,000 people, scientists and engineers emigrate. That's a lot of people, but it's also 2 to 3% of the number of people who were working in the Soviet scientific infrastructure beforehand. That's not much compared to the numbers of 55% that we were seeing. So what's happening? This is where internal drain comes in. Internal drain is by far the largest proportion in all of these numbers. There are more jobs in other sectors that are not science, and there's less funding for science. All of you I know this. We know, and I'll get to this in the next section, that even small amounts of money on the margin kept people in science. So what you see many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people leaving science for another sector, that's because they need to feed themselves and feed their families. So most of what is going on in the transformation of the labor market for science in the former Soviet Union is not people leaving the country. And it's not even a critique or an inadequacy of the structure of Soviet or post-Soviet science. It's a set of economic decisions based on the structure of the market and the economy more generally. It doesn't actually tell you that much about science. Yet this contraction in the labor market is framed as a science issue. There's also a hidden drain, which is not captured in the numbers at all. That's people who are kept on the books as still employed at the various institutes. They draw a very tiny salary, yet they don't do any science because there's no time and resources for that. They're still therefore employed in science, but it's not doing anything for scientific productivity. This phenomenon seems to be a bit higher in Russia than in the other post-Soviet states, because in Russia, there's much more resistance to shutting down institutes entirely than you have in some other places, although that comes later. Another thing that is missing in all this data, and is part of the reason I think brain drain is a very bad way to frame this situation, is that it doesn't say anything about who is leaving. What are the characteristics of the set of people who are going? Which fields are they in? And are some fields transformed more extensively than others? Are they the really good people? Are they the really bad people who can't find jobs within the post-Soviet science sector, or not? Or is it irrelevant what their research potential is? One thing that seems to be true is that the active scientists who left were in their 30s or 40s in terms of age. That's important because of Russia's population pyramid. This is Russia's population pyramid on the bottom. The one on the top is Mexico, which I'm giving you for an example of what most population pyramids look like. This is the number of people in a population at any point in time. This is 2010 for both of them, by their age in the population. They usually look a little bit like a teardrop. However, the population pyramid of Russia does not look like that. It's not symmetric male-female, and it has tremendous fluctuations. Any familiarity with Soviet history will tell you what this is. This is World War II, is what you're seeing. You're seeing the long tail of transformations from World War II in terms of tremendous population loss and displacement. It's a very sad graph to look at. The implications for this for science is that you're missing a very specific generation of people, in that there was a much smaller cohort of a particular age range who ended up dying on the front or in Leningrad or in other contexts. So the long-term damage of losing your first post-war generation is actually that there is actually much more severe than the numbers alone indicate. So if people who are leaving in the late 80s are people who were born in the late 40s, that is much more detrimental in terms of the shape of the employment curve and age distribution within science than if they were 10 years older or even 10 years younger. Again, I'm not saying that this is not an important phenomenon. This is a very important phenomenon. And it occupied most of the attention of the commentators in the USSR and abroad. You can see a lot of attention to brain drain, very little discussion of these particular shape and demographics of the Soviet scientific community and the post-Soviet scientific community. There's a huge focus on the external brain drain that you can see in almost every newspaper. I just picked a couple of headlines that from this period. There are many, many others. There are quite a few short books that are published, all with a strong crisis mentality. Some of them in the Soviet context, and some of them in the Soviet context, and some of them from Western powers as well. You can see that these articles mostly cluster, and I'm not cherry picking around the time of the Depression that hits right at the end of the Soviet Union. I think that's and then the stories start to fade from the headlines by the mid-1990s. That's actually not fully represented in the amount of emigration from former Soviet space, which continues later than that. But I think it's a clue to what's going on with the rhetoric of brain drain, which is what I want to focus on for a minute before moving to the next section, and why the rhetoric of brain drain seems so useful to people. As a footnote, this term brain drain comes back later with reference to the post-Crimea emigration, but this is, first of all, much, much smaller. And two, it's concentrated in the social sciences, law, and the humanities. It's not a phenomenon on the scale with others, but it's interesting that the template and the language is very much tied now to Russian, not just post-Soviet, but Russian space. So why does the rhetoric of brain drain prove so important a model for how to talk about this period? And the answer has to do with perceptions of national security, I think. Both Russian, primarily Russian, because the discourse is stronger there, and American discourse focuses on brain drain and national security, and you often find the comments put together. This has to do with nuclear weapons. Both the Russian elites and the state and the pundits and the Americans promote a vision of nuclear brain drain, that the reason why the brain drain matters is not anything to do with this potential for research in Russia afterwards, et cetera. What matters is that you might have nuclear scientists leaving the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and heading to North Korea or Libya. This is a very common theme in many of the publications. However, there's almost no evidence that this was ever going to happen. Surveys of residents in the formerly closed cities showed almost no desire to emigrate at all, let alone to those countries, which is a tiny amount of interest. So why hype it so much? I think because there were actually proliferation risks in this period, an issue of worry about the spread of nuclear weapons. But it didn't have anything to do with people. It had to do with nuclear materials and what's called materials protection, control, and accounting. That is stored plutonium, protecting the plutonium, and making sure it doesn't go anywhere. The Russian state wanted to secure its nuclear stockpiles. This is the post-Soviet Russian state, where security measures like fences and locks were actually very hard to find. They were the protection was quite weak. A famous statement from one official at the time is that potatoes were better guarded than nuclear weapons. The reason for that is that Soviet nuclear security, which was quite strict, relied on the control of personnel. It relied on the KGB to follow people around and monitor information and contacts, and it was quite good at that. And therefore, the materials were protected because you knew what the people were doing. After the USSR, the personnel aren't the problem, but sales of plutonium and other materials potentially are. Fixing this is actually quite straightforward how to do it. It requires you to upgrade physical security and put locks and checklists, et cetera, but it's expensive. The Russian state and American policymakers pressure Congress to spend a large amount of money of this kind of aid to Russia. That is aid to fix the infrastructure of protecting nuclear weapons. But the way it's justified is through language of brain drain and personnel, so even though that's not what's being actually protected. Both of the books you see here are about employing the personnel, and that's what the rhetoric was about. But the real money, I want to point out, goes to infrastructure, and there's no way to get money for it without a brain drain narrative. So the internal brain drain, the contraction of the labor market, which is the much bigger phenomenon, is under stressed in sources around the world because it's not useful. And once the funds and materials are secured, which is around 1994, you see a drop in any interest in this rhetoric. So that's where I want to end with part one, preliminary statement about the labor migration. This brings us to money. There's a very big story about state funding. The post-Soviet states received significant amounts of scientific funding and aid from the US, the European Union, and Japan. But I want to just concentrate briefly on non-state funding from non-governmental organizations because it's a more interesting episode from a history of science / history of knowledge point of view. The role of non-state funding in science is very well known in the historiography. Two principal examples are visible here. The ones on the left are largely about the Rockefeller Foundation, which funded an enormous amount of biological research in the second quarter of the 20th century, especially in the area that would later be labeled as molecular biology. The term itself, molecular biology, is coined by an administrator in the Rockefeller Foundation. So this funding is very extensive. It ranges from many Europeans who came to the United States, including Theodosius Dobzhansky, the great evolutionary biologist, who was originally from Ukraine, then moved via Leningrad to the US, as well as Americans who went to Europe. Most famous of those is probably James Watson, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, who traveled to Copenhagen and then Cambridge on Rockefeller Foundation money. On the right, John Kriege makes a stronger point that after World War II, American foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation worked together with the US government on the post-war reconstruction of science in Europe. Non-governmental organizations played a significant role also in the transition to post-Soviet science, but I don't think there's evidence for a stronger Kriege-style explanation where the State Department and the CIA work with the foundations in order to try and coordinate and restructure Soviet science. I just don't think there's evidence for that. The US government was certainly interested in the transformation of Soviet science, both in 1945 and in 1991. But while the US government was interested in the transformation of Soviet science, I do want to say that in 1945 and 1991, the US government was interested in doing that. In the case of 1991, the non-state actors are actually not interested in transformation at first. They're mostly interested in preservation, trying to keep the Soviet science model going for longer. One of the earliest efforts comes from scientific societies. I'm mostly using American examples here, which is where most of the activity comes from. These are groups like the American Astronomical Society, the American Mathematical Society, the American Physical Society, and the American Chemical Society, almost all in the physical sciences. What's distinctive about all these organizations is that they are also publishers. They're not just non-professional organizations for scholars. The Physical Society, for example, publishes dozens of journals and also published English translations of Soviet journals. Because of how international exchanges worked in the Soviet period, the leadership of these organizations had quite a few personal contacts with scholars in the former Soviet Union, and their first impulse is not to send money over, it's to send journals over. It's about continuing the exchange of scientific information, which is the thing that they're most worried about being disrupted. These are the American scientists. The Soviet and post-Soviet scientists have different worries. This is both a generous impulse and it's kind of a strange one. Any knowledge of the economic situation in Russia, Ukraine, or elsewhere in this period would indicate that the key problem for scientists in this area is not the inability to subscribe to journals. That's just not what you would find if you asked around in 1991. But this was the lever that these organizations had, so they used it. These donations were clearly welcome. But my point is that this mechanism is not about structural transformation. It's not about trying to change anything about how Soviet science or post-Soviet science works, but instead to maintain the high quality of Soviet science for longer in the structures it now has by removing some of the financial costs that came with scientific communication. These particular archival documents I have up here are from 1994, but efforts sending journals over actually started as early as 1989. But all of these organizations are also nonprofit societies, and they don't have a lot of money. Both to pay for the shipping and to recoup costs, they turn to organizations like the International Science Foundation, which ends up spending a lot of money to help them ship these journals over. There's an enormous amount of correspondence in the American archives about this. And that's also what I was able to access before everything changed. So the International Science Foundation, as you all know, is the creation of George Soros. And it's one of the more unique attempts to rescue post-Soviet science. And rescue is the term that you often find at the time. At first, this was also dedicated to preservation and then shifted towards transformation reasonably quickly. A detailed history of the activities of the ISF, written from its own documents, was produced by Irina Dezhina, and it was published in both Russian and English. and it's invaluable. In part, also, it's really good work on its own, but also, I think Soros threw out all the archival materials afterwards. So there's no other way to reconstruct it. One question that is still not entirely clear from the very good work done on this topic, including by Andrei Ilin and Ksenia Belik, who I know are on this call, is why fund specifically Soviet science, post-Soviet science? Like, why is this the thing that Soros wants to do? There are no archives, as I mentioned, of the ISF. So I've been trying to piece together the rationale of Soros from a number of different sources, largely the personal files of some of his main players. Soros, who emigrated from Hungary, ran an enormously successful hedge fund, the Quantum Fund, and made a gigantic amount of money. In the 1980s, he already had created a philanthropic foundation, and he donated money to several causes. Most of them are about increasing democracy. He was very inspired by his teacher in London, Karl Popper. He donated to South Africa, he donated to China, and he also tried various small efforts in the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s, including funding research travel by scientists on an ad hoc basis. It wasn't a formalized structure. Through the biologist Valery Soifer, who is at George Mason University now, but was then also in George Mason, but he spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, Soros met Sakharov shortly before Andrei Sakharov's death. Soifer has published his own version of events, which doesn't agree with everybody's recollections, but are consistent with most of the evidence. According to Soifer, he was the one who persuaded Soros, when the Soviet Union dissolved, that Soros should act to save Soviet science. That is, save the people and the mechanism of producing knowledge that the Soviet Union had established, but without the political structure and the economic structure that both Soifer and Soros agreed should go. Before the end of the USSR, Soifer stressed the argument that scientists were the key to democratization, using the example of Sakharov as the most central point of that. And also that science is an intrinsically democratizing force, which is something that Popper argues as well. Soifer believes this strongly, that there's this connection between science and democracy. I should say that the historical and sociological evidence is more mixed on that. And then something happens in September 1992. On the 16th of September 1992, Soros broke the British pound by betting against it, and in the process made $1 billion, $1 billion. That is a very large amount of money, and it comes with a very large amount of taxes. In the American system, one way of avoiding paying lots of taxes is by donating it to charity. And so what Soros does is establish the International Science Fund and pour $100 million into it. He also did other things. He created the Open Society Institute, the university that was in Budapest and is now moving to Vienna, and other organizations. I'm setting those aside for now. My main point here about the timing is that it wasn't like he created this organization when the Soviet Union dissolved. It's a year later. And it's more that Soros had a need to spend a large amount of money. And Soifer and others had already created the idea that saving Russian science was something that might be doable with some of this money. And so he devoted $100 million to it. The creation of the ISF is partially an ideological impulse, but it's also largely an issue of timing and when the money happens to appear. There are three basic parts to the program of the International Science Foundation, and Dejina is very clear on this if you want to look in more detail. The first and the most immediate is in 1993 to give $500, one time only, to any scientist who has published 3 articles in a Western peer-reviewed journal or an equivalent. There was a list of equivalent Soviet journals that counted in the previous 5 years. So 3 articles in the previous 5 years. All you had to do was fill out a form with your name, your address, and the 3 articles and send it in. 28,000 people received these $500. The list of the journals is interesting. It was created by Eugene Garfield's Institute in Philadelphia, which is what created the Science Citation Index. So if you want to look for the deep roots of the Scopus obsession of grant agencies, there's some of it here. This program, the emergency grants program, happened extremely quickly and was organized in a way that looks very improvisational now. Cash was sent over with individual academics bringing money with them and knocking on people's doors and handing them $500 without much of a structure or control over it. Lauren Graham was one of those people who went over and handed out money. Given that this was the winter of 1993, which is an extremely economically devastating winter, it was especially important that the money happen fast and that it go directly to people. This particular program is entirely about preservation. It has no implications for changing Soviet science or restructuring Soviet science. It doesn't ask anybody to do any particular kind of work. It's just about making sure that the scientists survive. It came with no conditions, no plan to do specific scientific work, and no external review. All you needed was a bibliography. And it was meant to sustain former Soviet scientists in a difficult moment. And it's done across the 15 republics of the former Soviet Union. The second one is the grant program. This is much larger in terms of the amount of money that was given and was specifically now about reform and transformation of Soviet science. The idea is to establish a peer-reviewed competitive grant scheme, and also in the process to encourage younger researchers, so not just the directors of the institutes at the Academy, and women who are outside the traditional hierarchies to apply and be funded separately. This has been studied more extensively by a lot of people, again by Dezhina and others, looking at the effects of the money as it moves around, and it lasted for a few years. The effect of entering competitive peer review as a structure for grant giving seems to have been quite successful. The Russian state was also doing something like this at the same time, so it's hard to disaggregate the two. Most of the $100 million goes here. The third is the ISSEP, which is Seufer's particular project. It was begun in February 1994, and it also lasts the longest until about 2000, 2001, when it shuts down its Russian activities. This is about preserving the strong tradition of pre-university education in the sciences and mathematics through scholarships, rewards to teachers, and sustaining a transnational network of educators, such as like the network of educators that existed when the Soviet state provided that. In Ukraine, this one was particularly controversial. There's a lot of documentation on this at Columbia University in the archives, if anybody is interested in exploring it further. So did it work? There are testimonials from many people about the benefits, which Ilin and Belik use. There are also many critiques by the recipients, especially of the bigger grants. Some of the norms really do shift, although whether that shift is attributable to the International Science Foundation or the MacArthur Foundation, or whether it's due to the RFFI, the Russian state's NSF-based grant system, is hard to tell. However, this Ganguly paper, the one on the left, shows a very strong result. The Soros program, the emergency grants program, makes for a natural experiment in economic terms. You have a cutoff between those who had 3 papers published in the 5-year window and those who had it in a 6-year window, or those who only had 2 papers in the 5-year window. So it took that data set of people who made it and who didn't make the cut, and then follows them over a 10-year window and sees where they were in 10 years. There is a 40% increased likelihood that a researcher would still be in science if they got the Soros money than if they didn't. Some of that is measuring who the most productive scientists were because they had the number of publications, but if you control for that, you can see a lot of this is just keeping people from moving from one labor market to the other labor market. And it's a hugely successful program. It keeps a lot of people who would have left science back in. As all of you know about the backlash that happens to the program, but also more specifically to Soros, who has become a particular lightning rod for criticism, especially on the political right. And since foreign agents are specifically problematic in a legal sense in Russia today, that backlash continues. The Soros example was part of the motivation for that law, of course, but and as a result, it has deterred a more open accounting of the significance of these philanthropic contributions at a specific moment in time. That is, what did they do in the early 90s, as opposed to what implications they might have for Russia today. It's especially ironic that those parts that were not about intervening in Russian practices, such as giving money, with no strings attached are attacked alongside those that are much more interventionist. There's much more one could say here, but I will move on. Of course, there's a lot of other grant funding too. The Russian state has its own program. And that kind of National Science Foundation or European Research Council modeled grant system happens in basically every post-Soviet state and every post-communist state. Some kind of structure like that is built up. At least all of the ones that I've managed to look at so far, there are at least 24. It takes a lot of time to do this, but I'm not comprehensively through it yet. But to continue the theme of foreign aid for science, I think it's important to flag two other important sources of American state funding for Russian science. The first is the Nun Luger Bill, which is what I was mentioning earlier. That's the American focus on non-proliferation, which involves science funding as a way of deterring emigration for proliferation purposes. Although that's a great deal of money, not all of it was spent or spent within the former Soviet Union, given strict auditing conditions that were imposed upon it by Congress. The second form of funding that I think has been undervalued as a form, there's been a second form of funding that I think has been undervalued as a form of foreign aid for science, and that's space. Here, the crucial year is 1986 for two reasons. First, because of what happens on the 28th of January, when, and this image is for people of my generation in the United States, a very salient image, the destruction of the Challenger space shuttle upon launch. Beginning with that disaster, which slowed down the US shuttle program, the United States started subcontracting to both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China to launch satellites. You can also see, it's also important that in 1986, shortly after, within a month after the Challenger incident happens, the Soviet Union launches the Mir space station. This is Mir in its full form. It didn't look like this in 1986. But after the Apollo-Soyuz mission and the American landings on the moon, so first landings on the moon, then the Apollo-Soyuz mission, the Soviets reorient a lot of their space efforts towards building space stations for long-term habitation, very successfully. And Mir is one of the most successful of those, and it lasts from 1986 to March 23rd, 2001. It's a very long span for this station to exist. So that in 1986 is actually a year when you see that the Soviet Union occupies a particular position in the space world that is very prominent. This is a list of all, a sort of pie chart of all the launches that happened in the year 1986. And you can see that the Soviet Union has over 85% of the launches that year, largely because the Americans ground everything after Challenger. But this gives the Soviet launch industry, and that becomes the post-Soviet launch industry, a real foothold. And they have a very large position in the space launch business towards the end of the Soviet period. This is, I know, all pre-1990. I'm giving this for a reason. This continues throughout the 1990s. In 1996, the Chinese are cut out of the space launch business. Even as the Americans start launching again, they're still offloading and paying for launches to happen at Baikonur through the Russian Space Agency. After the accident of Columbia in February 1st, 2003, which is another destruction of a space shuttle upon reentry, the shuttle program basically dies and the US becomes completely dependent on Russian launchers to get people into space up until basically exactly a year ago when Elon Musk's SpaceX launched people into space. But there's a tremendous reliance on the post-Soviet launching market. This gives you a different picture of post-Soviet science when you focus on the space industry, in part because of funding. So basically, the Russians are doing all this launching on a shoestring budget. So this is the 2013 space budgets of various countries. You'll notice the American one, and then you'll notice the Russian one is third. There's a rather significant difference in amount of money paid for a space program in this year. Much of that American money is going to fund the launches of Americans up to the US space, up to the International Space Station, which is something like between $50,000 and $100,000, $50,000 and $100 million per astronaut that is heading up there. So there's a tremendous amount of wealth transfer from the American state budget to the Russian state budget through space. This is deliberate. The Clinton administration was quite clear that it wanted to be spending this money on the Russian Space Agency because it's a way to continue to fund the Yeltsin regime without going directly through Congress and without classifying it as foreign aid. And this is part of what keeps the International Space Station as an idea alive through the 1990s. It's clear that the Russians also know it's important. So this is the amount of money that's being spent. This is the percentage of each country's gross domestic product that's being spent on space. And the Russians spend more of their economy dedicated to space than any other country, in part because it's a good investment and it brings in money, especially during this particular 1990 to 2010 period. Okay, the third part. The focus here is on a question that's fascinated me for a long time, which is the sameness of modern science. This is not a new observation. I'll try to be quick about this. I know I'm going too long. Bruno Latour emphasized with his centers of calculation and multiplications of context that science looks the same in many places. And the way modern science works as a form of knowledge is by replicating in the same context over and over again. His interest was in how laboratories generate reliable knowledge. I'm more interested in the broader structure of the political economy of science. With the end of Soviet science, there is, roughly speaking, only one way of organizing science around the world, a model based on flexible labor, peer-reviewed competitive grant funding, and collaboration with industry. Soviet science had different organizational patterns, which had their own weaknesses, but also their own strengths. The literature, both Russian and Western, does not emphasize the strengths, but the strengths are real. And there was a sameness across science in the second world, in the socialist world, represented in institutions that resembled each other in the USSR, Eastern Europe, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, and to a large degree also China. With the end of the USSR, those institutions start to diverge according to different trajectories as they approach the Western neoliberal model. In this section, I want to trace some of the divergence as well as an example of resistance to it. It's common in discussing political history in the former USSR to stress the legacies and continuities. This is a case where I think we can see how hard it is to maintain a legacy in the area of science. The example I'm going to use is focused on Academies of Sciences. These are about 10% of how the Soviet science system is structured, so it's by far not the majority, but it's an area that has tremendous transnational implications. As you all know, in 1724, Peter the Great erected an academy on the banks of the Neva River in St. Petersburg. There has been an Academy of Sciences since then, but it's misleading to think of the Academy of Sciences as necessarily continuous. And if we pay attention to how they move over time, you get interesting results. There's no Russian Academy of Sciences until 1991, but there is a Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1918 that is radically restructured in 1932. And then each of the 15 republics gets one, except Russia, which does not get one. With the exception of the first two, the Soviet one and the Ukrainian, they all fall in Stalin's time. But there's also an interesting progression. Central Asia has a progression starting in the middle of World War II, and the Baltic states, exactly around World War II, get theirs very shortly after incorporation into the Soviet Union. This is part of a more general pattern. This list is not complete, but you can see that in almost all the communist countries, they get their Academies of Sciences very shortly after their regime is set up. And they look similar in structure. I don't have time to get into this. Some of these, like the GDR and the Czechs, had their own academy beforehand that's transformed. Many others did not. So what happens when the unifying structure of the Soviet Union falls away? There are two trajectories, but they end up in the same place. The first trajectory is abolition, which only really happens fully in East Germany. But then again, the country also stops existing. So that's part of it. As part of the Einheitsvertrag, the Union Treaty of 1990, it was decided that the science system of East Germany would be entirely absorbed within that of the West. What that principally meant is that the Academy of Sciences ceased to exist. A Wissenschaftsrat is set up to evaluate which of its many institutes will be preserved, which abolished, and which spun off and privatized as business. Many of the science ones are transformed into parts of universities or private industry. But if you look at the 15 humanities and social science institutes, which are the most hardly hit, only one of them, the one on Sorb culture, is preserved. The other 14 are abolished. By the end of 1991, you end up with a Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, which is local for the state of Berlin-Brandenburg. You have a National Academy of Sciences, which is Leopoldina, which is based now in Halle in the east, but was one of the few trans-German institutions during the Cold War. It's purely honorific, has no institutes. And then the institute structure is folded into the Max Planck Institute, the Fraunhofer Institutes, and the so-called Blue List Institutes with industry. These are all West German structures. So this academy just vanishes, it's gone. Abolition of a sort also happens in Turkmenistan. In 1998, Yazanov took direct control of his successor institution and essentially abolished it. Part of his quite unusual program to restructure all of Turkmen culture around his own ideology. In 2019, Berdi Muhamedov, his successor, reopens it, although significantly reduced from what it had been in 1991. So abolition is pretty rare. What happens instead? The second trajectory is to turn them into honorific institutions. It's easiest to see in the Baltic states. These three are all built in the wake of incorporation into the Soviet Union. Although these are prestigious, well-funded academies, they did a lot for the economy and science of each state. They were also perceived as symbols of occupation. So they are all reformulated on the Nordic model, honorific institutions with the research institutes closed or sold off. Latvia's was renamed the Latvian Academy of Sciences in March 1990. In 1997, the Latvian parliament passed a law declaring that the Academy of Sciences was a, quote, permanently legally established institution, was permanently legally established as an important institution of the renewed Republic of Latvia and no longer perceived as a relic of the Soviet regime, end quote. Its history is now rewritten to be a successor institution to the Latvian Academy of Sciences, which was declared in 1935 by Prime Minister Kārlis Ulmanis and founded only as an Institute of History in 1936. And it was dissolved in 1939 with the repatriation of the Baltic Germans. So legally, this is the originating institution of the current Academy of Sciences with the Soviet period excised. In Lithuania, in 1989, the Lithuanian Academy declares its independence of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. It now claims that its originating institution was either Vilnius University in 1579 or the proposal for a Vilnius Academy of Sciences in 1773. This institution is honorific, but it does have institutes, and some of them even expanded in the 21st century. Estonia, in 1988, the General Assembly adopted a resolution to declare it was actually founded in 1938. It changes its name in 1989. It's purely honorific. In each of these cases, we can see a clear rewriting of the history and an attempt to build a narrative of continuity from the pre-Soviet era. Most of the significant features of Soviet-style academies have been eliminated in these cases. Although the historical rewriting is not as evident in allied states of the Soviet bloc, some of the same patterns happen. In Hungary, reforms of science funding began in the mid-1980s before Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union to allow for greater private enterprise in academy institutes and more contract labor for scientists in the West. They only recently got rid of all their institutes, though. The same is true for Cuba. Although Cuba changed politically and economically the least of the post-Soviet states immediately in terms of economic relations, this period is very economically severe in Cuba. It's called the Periodo Especial, the special period. It does begin to spin off its academy institutes into autonomous research institutions in this period. So even though the state does not reform significantly, its science follows the same pattern you see in Poland, Czechoslovakia, then Czechia and Slovakia, and so on. The obvious question is, what about Russia? I expect you all know this story. In late November 1991, a month before the dissolution of the USSR, all of the Academy's properties on Russian soil are transferred to the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, and thus to the Russian Federation. At first, it seemed to continue as before, and despite a vibrant discussion about how to reform it, from 1959, I'll skip all this part about the National Academy of Sciences. Anyway, domestically, almost none of the academy institutes closed in the 1990s, and they're very proud of this, although most are barely funded and many exist only on paper. It continues to have ups and downs until 2013, when the institutes of the academy are moved to FANO, the Federal Agency of Scientific Organizations, which also takes over the properties. And the real estate is important here. In May 2018, FANO is dissolved as an independent agency and put under the Ministry of Education and Science. This means that the Academy doesn't officially control any institutes anymore. It has a presidium, but doesn't preside. And getting elected an academician is still a big deal. It comes with money. It's an important status. But this masks the fact that basically the Russian academy is not that dissimilar from the Baltic academies now. In terms of its structure, it's an honorific for your work that has come at a long period of time, although it comes with more money. But there's one interesting counter movement to this, the International Association of Academies of Sciences. This is a Russian stamp commemorating its logo. This organization was created in 1993 and links together all the former Soviet academies minus the Baltics, but not just them. Slovakia is a member, Vietnam is a member, and there are several other former socialist states with observer status. It was originally based in Kiev and now it's in Minsk. It's founded by Boris Paton in 1993 when he was president of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. As he never tires of saying, he was born the same day as the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and he remained president. I'll skip his biography, which is fascinating. He remained president until March of 2020 when he was 101 years old, which means he survived Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, the economic depressions, 2 orange revolutions, and the current war, which is an impressive rate anyway. So he, however, imagined a future by recruiting a particular vision of the Soviet past. He founded this organization in 1993. Practically speaking, the organization has never had any resources or many resources to disperse and functions as a coordinating body that hosts pleasant receptions and issues science-affirming declarations. Symbolically, though, it's interesting. Paton lamented the dissolution in late November 1991 of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, to which he had been elected in '63. And what he wants instead is that instead of there being a presidium in Moscow, which controls the academies, there should be a coordinating organization that links together and provides the same kind of communication across ranges and regions that existed before. This is Paton's vision of how to resurrect the what he saw as the comedy and cooperation of intra-USSR science while functioning in a world of changed political structures. So it's a kind of silhouette of the coordinating functions of the Soviet Academy and thus of Second World science. There's more I could say, but I should get to the conclusions because I'm going too long. Thank you for your patience through the presentation, which I regret is still preliminary in many respects. I'm going to give some preliminary conclusions now, 4 of them. The first is that Soviet science was transnational and not just a sort of expanded version of Russian science. It makes sense that post-Soviet science is also transnational, but it's transnational in a different way. It doesn't have the same structures and the same mechanisms for maintaining its linkages across borders. The second is that the Cold War legacies of nuclear weapons and space technology are central throughout this transformation, but again, differently than the way they were central to the organization of Soviet science. The third is that the temptation is to get quantitative data because that's what organizations and governments were collecting in the 1990s and use these graphs and tables as ways of explaining what happened. I think that's massively limited because the actual lived experience is very different from what the numbers show. And the only way to actually get the history done is to do a more fine-grained, high-resolution analysis on multiple levels. And that's a lot of work that I hope a lot of people do. Some people have already started that work. We should have much more of it. It's been 30 years since these events. There's plenty of time now to start getting at it. And there's also more documents than you would think. And the final point is a hypothesis, which I'm not sure I will defend, but I'm just positing it, which is that many of the key features of post-Soviet science systems in all of these successor countries are actually established in the first 5 years or so after the Soviet dissolution. That if you start looking at what's established now, you can find real discontinuities and transformations in the early 1990s. So that many of the things that Putin does to reform post-Soviet science, to reform Russian science, are legacies of this particular moment when there was a lot of transformation by necessity, but also a lot of ideological rethinking about what post-Soviet science could become. Спасибо за ваше внимание, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts and suggestions. I will stop my share.
Спасибо большое, Michael. Thank you so much. I suppose Maybe now the participants have some time for short questions for clarification of some moments or so on.
Zinaida Vasilieva would like to ask the question with the hand.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I have two immediate questions, but maybe I will ask something later as well. So my first question is about the general argument. So do I understand correctly that the fourth conclusion that you made, that many of the elements of the contemporary structure has been established in the 1990s, goes kind of against the assumption that the contemporary politics kind of works on the remains of the Soviet science, and that basically you are trying to say that it was already something else, but not the skeleton of the Soviet science. So it's one clarification question. And the second one is about the brain drain and the space industry, because when you spoke of the brain drain, you commented mainly on the immigration from the field of physics and nuclear, especially with the focus on the nuclear legacies. And I wonder if you have any data on the migration from the space industry, because one could think from what you presented in your second part that actually the space industry received so much funding in the 1990s, since the late 80s, let's say in the 1990s, that it could actually perhaps avoided this the fate of this massive outmigration, while kind of I from my observation it's not really the case, but I wonder if you have any specific data on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Both good questions. It's also good to see you again. It's been a long time. So the first one, I think there's two implications of the hypothesis. The first is that it isn't just a strict continuity across, like there's a standard claim. There are two standard claims I don't like. The first is post-Soviet science is basically just the legacies of Soviet science. It's like the residues and the reconstructions from that. And so I don't think that's accurate, because there is a lot of discontinuity and transformation that happens, not just with personnel leaving science, which is very large, but also in terms of the ideas people have and the structures that emerge. The second thing I don't like is that Putin just restructures everything starting in 2000, 2001. And that what you see as Russian science now are a set of organizations that were established later, once there is greater economic and political stability. And you see variants of this argument in many post-Soviet, post-socialist countries. And I don't think that's true either. I think the moments of instability, like the early 90s, and you see this in Ukraine, which is much more unstable in the early 90s, there's a lot of ideas and institutions begin then that are only implemented much later. So I think that this period of time was important for rethinking what could happen. And that's both with respect to the future and the past. So I think that the 90s gets cut out because it's a smuta of some kind that people don't like talking about, and it's more productive. About the space industry, I can only offer a couple of things here because I don't have as good data on this. The first is that part of the emigration that you see from Central Asia to the Russian Federation is space related. People who are based in Baikonur, so they're part of a brain drain in data, but they don't leave science. They just move into a science sector based in the Russian Federation. The second point is that my focus here was on what the Americans use as their rhetoric for paying lots of money and what the Russians use as their rhetoric to get a lot of money about protection. And that happens around the nuclear realm. It happens to a smaller degree around the missile realm. So it has a space aspect because people are worried about missile proliferation, but it seems to have much less salience, that particular story. If you look at, and Asif Siddiqui was here, I don't know if he still is, he might actually know the data on this, I don't have it yet. I expect if you looked at the amount of money that is spent, it's much more efficient now than it was then. That is, the space industry contracts while still being immensely productive in terms of launches. So I expect there's a contraction of personnel, even without a contraction of activity. But that's a hypothesis I have not yet investigated, and I should. Thank you.
Thank you. I have also questions from Ksenia Cherkaev and Nikolai Sorin-Cheykov, and so please would be more quickly. Okay, Ksenia.
Thank you. That was great. Especially, I like the part about Soros. I thought that was extremely interesting. So a small question, which may or may not be central to your study, but coming from the U.S. Academy to the Russian Academy, what I found really jarring are the metrics. Mm-hmm. Metrics everywhere. And is that a history that you can trace also to the 90s, or can you trace it back to Soviet science?
So I don't think you can trace it to Soviet science. There are metrics. You can find a lot of data about science in the Soviet Union. They collected data on various things, but not this obsession with metrics. I would hesitate to, I don't know where it comes from because it happens in Britain in the 80s. And I'm not sure whether the model is imported from Thatcher, like it's an imported model that comes from a particular desire to have a more efficient system, or if it's something that grows out of some of the information and models that are being shown to the Soviet science policy planners in the 1990s, like Soros saying, send me 3 articles in these kinds of journals. I'm inclined to think that that has some impact in making it seem normal, but there are so many ways in which science policy becomes metrified over this, that's a terrible term, but when science policy becomes obsessed with metrics over the 1990s that I'm not sure I can isolate a single form. I do think, though, that it happens in Russia in the 1990s. Like that's where you find it. But I don't know what the cause is, because it is happening in the 1990s in other countries too, which are not former socialist countries. I would love to know the answer to this. And if anybody has suggestions or thoughts, I would love to hear more about those. So I wish I could offer you a better answer.
Thank you. И Nikolai Sorin-Cheykov.
Yes, hi. Thanks very much. I enjoyed that loads. My question is, when you give your hypothesis that is of the importance of the early 90s, I just wonder if that doesn't privilege the as it were, the history of physics and the related things, which Zina I'd ask you about. But I wonder if you focus on the basically computer science, that narrative would be different, because of course it's the computer science itself was very much kind of expanded and kind of evolved very much as a result of these transformations. Thank you.
That's probably right. It's certainly the case that I am overemphasizing physics. That's partially my own personal bias as a researcher. But it's also, I think that the nuclear, since many people have wiped the nuclear out of their heads as though it's not still massively relevant, I think the nuclear's relevance is very significant. It's especially significant in Ukraine, but you can find elements of it in lots of places. It's also the case that if you look at continuous research programs from the Soviet period to later, some, and other people here have heard me talk about this, like the Soviet Human Genome Project, collapses in the 90s. But others, like the creation of super heavy elements in Dubna, that continues. So physics-related ones tend to live longer. So I've been focusing more, and this is, I take this provocation from you as actually very productive. I'm focusing more on things that are Soviet moving into post-Soviet and looking what survives, and looking less at what gets created, say in the late 1990s, that then expands. Computers is a major research area I need to do much more work in. And I now know more about the American side, and I need to figure out more about the other one. So I think you're right. There's definitely a bias that comes from my selection of sources, and the computing is a very good example. But other things like antibiotics and vaccines is something I would like to add in. And that's actually continuous, because there was a big Soviet industry that then kind of shrinks in the 1990s and then comes back. And I don't know if it's recreated in the 2000s or if it's actually continuous. And I need to look more deeply to see whether that would be true. So thank you. I have much to think about.
No, Konstantin Fursov, maybe last question before Alisa Kirchik's contribution. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Very interesting. I was a little bit late, so I might have missed some of your ideas. However, I would like to reflect on this Ksenia's point about metrics. To my view, this thing definitely matters. As long as I don't know exactly which sources did you use. However, when we compare figures about science from the Soviet period and post-Soviet period, these are two different frameworks. Therefore, when we see the decrease of funding or decrease of the number of employees in this area, we also should take into account that probably we are talking about two different views about science. That statistic that we have starting from mid-90s is more Western-driven with the OECD-like standards. However, what we observed in the Soviet period was, I would say, completely different from what we have now, and therefore maybe in some cases incompatible. So to my view, this is an issue also to think about when we consider disciplinary structure or let's see, mobility indicators, because we might think of different people that were related to science fields in the Soviet time and no longer related to science in terms of these new statistical and policy frameworks.
I completely agree. This is actually my point 3, that you can't use just the metrics and the data, is because the data doesn't measure the same thing. Like, who counts as a scientific worker is, the number 1 million I use from a Western researcher, Murray Feshbach, attempting to construct a number that makes sense according to OECD criteria in 1980. So he tries to do something like that. But so much of the history of this period is written out of these data, not recognizing your exact point that the data is not continuous. The data is not measuring the same thing, which is why I think we need archivally based historical qualitative research across this period in order to show what different versions of what happened. Someone who is a much better statistician than me can try to fix the data and try and figure out ways to make them more compatible. I'm not interested in doing that. So I agree entirely with this interpretation. And I don't like showing that table of the decreases that happened based on 1990. However, I have to show something, and the effect, there is an effect there. Even if the numbers are wrong, it is absolutely clear that there is a major contraction in the scientific labor market across that decade. How big it is, I wouldn't say the numbers are actually very good at measuring 2 times as much. This is 20% more. I think that's very hard to do. Even after you get OECD data as standards, the collection protocols are, like, how good the statistical data used in those categories varies extensively across countries and in a single country over time. So I would like to be able to eventually give a talk like this showing no numbers at all and tell the story without the numbers, but I don't know how to do that yet.
Спасибо. У нас еще есть вопрос в чате, но и Николая Сорина Чайкова я вижу руку. Но, может быть, сейчас время для того, чтобы выступила Олеся Кирчик, а потом мы вернемся к этим 2 вопросам, наверное.
So to Katarina Stransova's question, I would like to find out the answer to that question, the one in the chat. I would like to find out the answer to this question about whether there is, that the Soros procedures create some of the frameworks. I know that the Soros people in the US, the people who were involved, think that happened. They think that they created a structure that then influenced state policy. I would need to get into the archives of the Yeltsin state to figure out how true that interpretation is. I don't know the answer to that yet. And that's one thing I would have done if in 2020 I could have been in Russia. And one could ask someone like Boris Saltykov about this, but there's also a reluctance in interviews to talk about the impact Soros might have had on policymaking because it fits into a foreign agent framework that is politically very sensitive. And I can understand why it would be hard to find that out from interviews.
Thank you. So, Олеся, please.
Спасибо, Саша. Я, если можно, на русский язык перейду. У меня только несколько замечаний, довольно коротких, но прежде всего огромное спасибо за этот доклад и за этот очень амбициозный проект, который, я очень надеюсь, будет успешно реализован, как только возможности для этого появятся. Ну, по крайней мере, то, что Майкл представил сегодня, была такая поистине энциклопедическая панорама, очень большим охватом, географическим и исторической глубиной, что очень важно. В то же время, мне кажется, это одновременно и как каким-то ограничением в том, чтобы пойти дальше, глубже в дискуссии, потому что, собственно, вот сам объект стремится как-то раствориться, не очень понятен. Там, что мне хотелось подчеркнуть, важная идея, что вот эта академия постсоветская и наука настолько неоднородный феномен, что о нем очень сложно говорить в целом, да, и находить какие-то общие факторы, какие-то закономерности или логики. Хотя, конечно, они присутствуют, это важная работа, я думаю, это важная рефлексия, ее нужно вести, безусловно. Но и очень важно также подчеркнуть вот эту игру между continuity, продолжением и на уровне структур, практик и идеологии, возможно, да, каких-то эпистемических культур, о которых пока еще сегодня не говорили, и в то же время изменений. И мне кажется, ни одна гипотеза не будет полной без учета этой парадоксальности какой-то, потому что я бы не рискнула поддержать ни одну из гипотез, ни гипотезу полной continuity или неизменности, ни радикальной ломки. В общем-то, еще, ну вот даже если практик, да, что я имею в виду о неоднородности и о том, что одни и те же какие-то факторы, которые Майкл назвал, могут служить где-то просто фактором стабилизации и выживания, а где-то фактором структурных изменений. Например, тот же пример с Соросом. Я совершенно согласна, что для большого числа ученых это была просто та маленькая помощь, которая просто помогла выжить, остаться в науке. И я верю в эти цифры, что 40%, возможно, остались благодаря тому, что получили вовремя эту финансовую поддержку. Но можно поразмышлять о том, что, например, в социальных науках, особенно в новых науках, социологии, политологии, антропологии, те новые социальные науки, которые, в общем-то, формировались только в постсоветский период в основном, и они же переживали самую большую трансформацию, для них не только помощь Сороса, но и многочисленные другие программы западные, в том числе и европейские, другие американские, сыграли действительно роль структурной трансформации. Они создали новую инфраструктуру для знания, можно даже сказать, с новыми институциями, центрами, журналами, новыми формами коммуникации, социабельности, поддержками для мобильности. Можно сказать, что какие-то новые формы жизни науки возникли благодаря этому. Да? Но опять же, потому что, может быть, эти сообщества, в отличие от физики, да, там, химии, других инженерных наук, для постсоветской академии они, такие области, как социология, антропология, остаются компактными, и для них такая поддержка, как частных филантропических фондов, может оказывать не только такое поддерживающее, но и радикально трансформирующее воздействие. То есть здесь действительно надо смотреть. Еще, думаю, мне представляется, что нужно иметь в виду, это и то, что я не очень, ну, довольно мало, то, чего было довольно мало в докладе, во всяком случае, это политика, научная политика, которая тоже была неоднородной весь этот период. И эта трансформация и реформа науки переживала несколько волн, и не была, это, как сказать, ее нельзя даже представить как усилие однородное в одном направлении на протяжении всего этого постсоветского периода. И как раз понимание того, как государство видело реформу науки, Академии наук, высшего образования и так далее, объясняет какие-то тоже тренды, которые так непонятны. Вот, например, стал вопрос, откуда взялись метрики. Метрики не взялись в 90-м году, не взялись даже не в 95-м и не в 2000-м, скорее в конце 2000-х годов, и это было связано с определенным изменением некой парадигмы и модели научной политики. Здесь тоже важно учитывать такой момент, что вовлеченность государства имеет, это не только финансирование. Государство имеет довольно широкий арсенал возможностей воздействия на науку и изменения, в том числе научного поведения и научных практик. И это было очень заметно как раз с введением этих количественных оценок публикационной активности и продуктивности ученых, ну, приблизительно от середины конца 2000-х годов. И на данном этапе, может быть, отвечу для Ксении, это было не столько, это не было не столько в продолжении с советскими попытками и опытами наукометрии, тут скорее разрыв такой в несколько десятилетий после этого произошел, а это связано скорее с импортом так называемых практик New Public Management, который происходил активно, и не только в сфере науки, но и в других сферах. Это новая парадигма как бы научного администрирования, научного управления, и которая более активно импортировалась, имплементировалась в таких странах, как Россия, в других постсоветских странах, и в таких странах, как Индия, Бразилия, Корея, да, и которые меньше, и эта волна нового публичного администрирования меньше ощущается в таких старых академиях, как в Европе, в Америке, мы этого почти не ощущаем, но почти во всех других странах мы чувствуем почти одновременно вот этот тренд. Ну, то есть можно говорить очень много, да, и я очень чувствительна к тому и солидарна с Майклом в том, что действительно анализ количественных паттернов очень ограничен, и вот качественный анализ поведения, изменения практик, изменения эпистемических культур и представления о том, что организационных культур, представление о том, что такое наука, как заниматься наукой, да, то есть это то, что мы можем оценивать только качественно. Вот, но это такой вот трейд-офф, да, потому что если мы хотим более широкую картину, то тогда нам нужны, конечно, количественные тренды и статистика, а если углубляться в какой-то качественный анализ вот этих практик, культуры, всего такого, то тогда, конечно, лучше идти в какие-то, видимо, на уровне даже стратегии этого анализа, каких-то областей более узких, наверное, потому что, опять же, эта академия очень-очень неоднородна, и кстати, один из эффектов, из результатов этой трансформации как раз есть эта неоднородность, она отчасти также ей была порождена, потому что такое ощущение, что изменения происходят не синхронно и не одинаково, не с одинаковой быстротой и глубиной, не только в разных областях науки, потому что одно дело социальные науки, как мы говорили, которые более структурные изменения произошли. Также еще есть фактор, и это ужасно для России, еще ее география и ее сложное такое географическое региональное устройство, то изменение в Москве, в провинции, в глубинке. Есть очень-очень все исследования, которых, кстати, Константин Фурсов может мне поправить, рассказать больше. Исследования показывают очень тоже большие различия в региональной динамике науки. Ну вот, это так быстрые замечания, можно, может быть, еще что-то придет в голову. Спасибо.
Thank you, Alicia. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Alicia. This is wonderful questions. I'll try to be brief in answering. The fundamental tension you point to in the situation is extremely heterogeneous. It's very heterogeneous across the sciences, across time, and across national borders. And this is I think my first point will address several of your questions, which is, and this is also related to the science policy one. I've done a lot of reading on the history of science policy. Part of the problem is the more I do that, the more Russian the story is. And I don't think the story is Russian. And so the more I make it about high politics and the transformation of high-level policy, which is obviously important, the more I have to decide which countries I'm going to look at, because it does change country by country and in a single country over time. And I think this is part of the reason why the studies that do exist now, there's a lot about East Germany. That's its own field. And it was studied while it was happening. So it's actually a very interesting secondary project to look at the history of how the history was written. But most of it's about Russia, because it's the biggest country and it has the most attention and the language is the one that people have. And I don't want to do it just about Russia. I feel like that's restrictive. In particular, because very basic comparisons between Russia and Ukraine are extremely helpful. But comparisons between Russia and Hungary are really helpful. I don't know Hungarian, but there is a lot of other stuff in languages I do know that help. That raises a second point, which is about the so I know I need to include the science policy stuff. I'm trying to figure out how to do that and keep the comparative and transnational aspects open. This restricts the scale of the work. The more I put in, the bigger it is, and then the harder it is. This is part of I used to think it was a 30-year history, and now I think it's less, so that I can do more of this texture. The second is, because of the languages I happen to know, I can't do Vietnam or North Korea. The reason why this is so disappointing is that Vietnam and North Korea are the ones that change the least. Like, they're the ones that stay closest to the original model. Cuba is one, I do know Spanish, so Cuba is one it's included because it's partially interesting, because it doesn't change politically, but does change culturally. It does change scientifically, the structure changes. But I would love to find out more about how North Korean science and Vietnamese science adapt in this period, because my sample, because of the Slavic languages and the other languages I know, tilts towards transformation, and probably tilts too far towards transformation. I know you didn't raise that specifically, but that's something that I was concerned about. The social sciences, this is an excellent point. The social sciences really change. And the place where I mentioned them, the East German example, is the clear case where they basically just abolish the old and establish a completely new one. I don't think of myself as a historian of the social sciences. It's possible for me to just restrict it to the natural sciences and thereby avoid this question. That would be cheating, but I think I could do it and just say the natural sciences are what I will look at. However, the social sciences example is very interesting because of the radical discontinuity it represents. And I think I need to make it much more explicit as part of the story, because it shows a path that could have been followed by the natural sciences, but wasn't. That option was there to basically completely restructure publications, restructure formats, and that was not done in the natural sciences for the most part. About the waves and scales of reforms, the generalization I want to make about the academies is that even though they all have very different timescales, like Fano happens in 2013, but that same reform basically happened in Budapest in 1989. So it's not that I'm making a sociological regularity. It's just that for various different reasons, following very different paths that are specific to each country, they all seem to end up at the same place at different times in terms of what they think an institute is supposed to be and what the relationship of an Academy of Sciences is supposed to be to the state and to its researchers. And they all have their own independent reasons for coming to that model, but I think it's still interesting that they all come to roughly the same model at the end. I don't know how to explain that fully, but I could just say each one is different, but I think that the fact that they all end up in the same place is an interesting fact. And, or they end up in places that look very similar. I think that I want to figure out more about how that works. I also take your point that it's not just money, but also regulations that the state has, that they have many levers by which they can reshape science. And that is something that I actually do want to include. One of the most important of those is visa policy, because it affects how people move in and out of a country and what kind of work people can do. Other things such as how you, because in the end, a lot of the metric stuff is tied to money. It's tied to your salary and your promotion and things like that. But there are other mechanisms that are in place that are extremely significant in relating to, in transforming science. My emphasis, and I think this conversation is pushing me there throughout, but this is where I started, is to emphasize those levers that are more transnational in orientation. That is, those that are not specifically within a national system, but are about the relations across national borders. And some of those are financial, but actually many of them are not financial. That's a place where you see a lot of productive state action that is not just about money. Basically, I want to say I agree very much with your position about the heterogeneity and the complexity of the phenomenon. And this is the challenge for me. If I'm going to make this work at all, I need to figure out a specific focus that will allow that heterogeneity to be seen, but without making it confusing. And then hope that many, many other scholars continue to do their work so that I can, so that we can all together get a better understanding of what happens. That's not an adequate answer to your comments, but thank you. Those are extremely helpful comments.
Thank you. I also saw in our chat comments by Irina Sirotkin about kitchen or dacha science.
Okay.
And its peculiarities.
Yeah. So this was a talk yesterday that some of you were at, that Slava Gerovich gave, about the way Krushki and other local smaller organizations like gatherings of scientists functioned in the Soviet period, and how they worked and what happens to them afterwards. I actually have I find Slava's work always extremely interesting, and this was also very thought-provoking. And part of the question is, what happens to that when Soviet science goes away? Because part of the argument that Danya Alexandrov and other people have made is that that happens because the reason those organizations work that way is because of political oppression or inability to organize because of anti-Semitism or other mechanisms within formal networks. However, I did work in the 19th century on chemists, and they do this too without that political repression feature. So it's not just a Soviet phenomenon. That's not the answer though. The answer I want to make to your question is, of course, it still exists. And in fact, it exists in many places that I wouldn't have expected it. There's a thing called the Russian American Science Association. Has anybody here ever heard of this thing? It exists in the US. It's co-founded by two emigres from the former Soviet Union. They have meetings once a year, which are in Russian, and much of it is history of science, where they talk about Mendeleev and other figures. And they continue to have, they form a network of people who are Russian speaking to present science work in Russian to each other, even though they publish it entirely in English. And they also build informal networks that are forms of communication that are social based on a past shared history rather than their current present. There are many organizations in Boston and New York from people who went to the same internats in Moscow, where they get together and talk and have informal structures. So those things all exist. I don't know what to do with them as a form of kitchen or dacha science, because they do actually produce new work, but they're extremely hard for me to get sources on or access to because they're closed as communities. But I think some elements of this still exist. However, I think it's less prominent than before because the ease of communication in other networks is higher. People are at farther distances, so they use electronic media more to communicate and not just gatherings in very small groups in local places. But I do think those patterns are still relevant. And it's one of the features that you see in emigration in particular of people who come from former Soviet space carry some of those social forms with them into the new one. So I would like to do more about it, but I have not yet.
Thank you, Michael.
Алексей Плешков. Можно по-русски, можно по-английски.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. It was really interesting. I mean, it's not exactly my field, but I was wondering about more general theoretical question. So I agree that some more or less usual methodological or theoretical, ways of doing in this field is strongly inadequate, as you said. And I was thinking while I was listening to Olesya Igorevna, don't you think that the virtue theory approach could be useful here? To focus on a particular practices and trying to understand the goods or goal of these practices, and trying to think about different epistemic virtues or virtues in more general sense could be useful here, because I start thinking that maybe there are more simple answers to some questions connected with just something about generations, because practices becomes different, and the goals of these practices, how we see it and how we can conceptualize it, becomes different. And then there are quite different virtues that we will see in the as something important to a scientific self or scholarly persona in the early 90s and, for example, in 2010s. And I start thinking that there are, even with this basis on practices, there will be not only big difference between subjects, scientific subjects, that there will be something like different sciences, different academia, like multiple temporalities, which are all at the same time there. So, I mean, I don't know, but what I heard, I think that this framework, theoretical framework, could be useful. Don't you think so?
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Can I also have some additions to Alexei's questions? Может быть, по-русски, чтобы было чуть-чуть яснее, про общую модель. Получается так, что в таких компаративных исследованиях наука выступает как часть транзитологических общих моделей. Да, то есть все постсоветские общества от Китая, Вьетнама до Кубы как-то развиваются после 89 года, да, и наука выступает как subsystem, да, как бы такая подсистема. Но возможно, да, это как бы такая гипотеза, нет ли у этих процессов в постсоциалистических странах какой-то своих особенностях, которые, может быть, не включаться в этот транзитологический сценарий. Тем более, что и классическая транзитология в духе Филиппа Шлиттера и так далее, она явно в последние десятилетия сама находится в кризисе. Я, слушая и вас, и очень интересную дискуссию, как раз думал про Джозефа Бен Дэвида с одной стороны, а с другой стороны про общие работы, например, Гросса и Фрикеля, в частности, которые Константин Фурсов пытался использовать и для советских и позднесоветских сценариев про scientific and intellectual movements. Дают ли вот эти множественные кейсы, которые вы так хорошо знаете, за последние 30 лет от бывшей Югославии, да, до Китая, включая и Советский Союз, и нынешнюю Россию, дают ли они основания для каких-то general conclusions, да, в духе, может быть, социологии науки, может быть, антропологии науки? Или это все-таки subsystem of general post-socialist transition? Sorry за как бы макаронизм и смену языков.
These are both very good questions, and they actually blend really nicely together. I'm going to start with Alexander and then get to Alex, I think, but I'll blend them together. There is an impulse to come up with general conclusions by doing this work. I actually don't want to do that. I don't want to have a story that is, this is what post-socialist science looks like in general as basic rules. I think Alessia is right that that's not a productive, that path is too hard to produce reliable information that's not incredibly skewed by your framework that you impose on it. However, and I think this is what you're pointing to here, the way the project is framed pushes me into making transitological arguments. It's almost impossible for me to avoid making claims that sound transitological when I frame it as there was Soviet science and now there are many post-Soviet sciences, and how do we get from one to the other? I need to think about other ways of framing this because I think the transitological model is not helpful. It assumes that there is a place that Russian science is supposed to go to, or Ukrainian science is supposed to get to, and that we know what the end point is and we're measuring its progress. And I just don't think that's accurate or productive or a good historical question. But nonetheless, I have framed the project in such a way, especially the third part about the Academies of Sciences, that I think it's impossible to avoid it unless I rethink how I frame it. So I think I need to reframe it. So I'm taking that point. And Alex gives an example of how I might do that. I haven't thought about virtue theory, but there's actually a very good way in which I think it might work here. Is the reason I showed the demographic curve of Russia is because, first of all, I think that graph is amazing, and I don't understand why people don't talk about it all the time because it's incredibly interesting. It's a reason why Russia is actually very different from a lot of other places, is it has a very different shape of its population. But the reason I show that is because the generational question is extremely important for how things work. However, I don't have that much time to look at multiple generations. But what I could do is take a couple of people, let's say a very closely related field, who had collaborated with each other. Some of whom end up in Germany, some of whom end up in the United States, and some of whom end up in Israel, and follow them and look at how the sort of virtue framework, their own value structure interacts with the new value structure they are in. And in that way, sort of look at a same generation across multiple places rather than one generation in the same. And I think that might help me also solve the Alexander problem, which is like, how do you get beyond looking at it as always about transitions? I've done a little bit of work with the Weizmann Institute in Israel, looking at some things there. I've done some work at the Max Planck archives, trying to find some things. I need to think about the only way that model will work is if I find an exactly perfect case study, but we're talking 20 to 30,000 people. I should be able to find a case study that can actually illustrate the problem at hand. Does this help address, especially Alexander's question? I hope this helps address the methodological question. I do think I need to think about this more. As some of you know, this past year, I've been the director of my department, and it has been extremely distracting from my ability to think about these big questions. So I'm very glad that now that I am no longer in that position, you have given me some real frameworks to think about this.
Jonathan Bauer's questions. Yes. Jonathan, please.
Thank you. And so first of all, thank you very much for this really, really interesting talk. To just put that into context, I'm actually working on a research project that's looking at the transformation in Eastern Germany, and where the scientists ended up and who continued to do research. And so I've got a question and a very minor question. So it's a follow-up to what you just said. So I have been wondering whether bringing the translations and publications of textbooks and other scientific books into this, because from what I have seen, there is a lot of collaboration of people who probably knew each other in the 70s and 80s that continues in the 90s with these both textbooks and textbooks in a very in a very simple sense, but from mathematics for engineers to stochastic analysis of X to really complex stuff. They at least I see that for the GDR, there is a lot of production of textbooks and translation of textbooks, and I would assume, because they collaborate with colleagues from all of the other Eastern states, that this might be a fruitful approach for transnational history to go more on the qualitative and maybe also to get in the virtues that the previous person has been talking about.
I don't want to cut you off. Yeah. What's the other question?
That's just, I'm curious about the state of the archives in Russia after. There's still a lot of transformation going on, or there was a lot of transformation going on, meaning a reshuffling of papers and files and getting rid of files and all these. That's what we see in our research, that it's really, really difficult to just get the papers, or the status is really not good.
Yeah, the archives question is also important, so I'll answer that second, though. I agree, the translations and publications and collaborations that continue are a good way forward. In particular, that would be very productive to look at across countries that are not Russia, or that do not include Russia, or that are not Soviet, not former USSR countries. So to what extent do you still end up with Czech-Polish collaborations that continue when the political structure that had enabled them break down. And I think they do still continue, and there's still a lot of transfer of people. I don't have enough good data yet, enough good examples to look at this stuff. The pandemic arrived at a time when I precisely wanted to do all the traveling, and the traveling will happen, but it will happen later. It'll take me longer to do this. One thing about the language that I actually connects to earlier work I've done, but I need to figure out how to make it here, is that this transformation in the global labor market for science and the global structures of science happens after English has already happened. So the scientists who move abroad from the former Soviet Union are generally already somewhat capable in English before they go. It's part of why they're able to get the job offers anyway. And some of these collaborations are mediated through English in a way that I'm still trying to figure out how to keep track of, because knowledge of English as your dominant foreign language is not distributed evenly. And it's much more common in physics than it is in a lot of other sciences. And so there are differentials depending what field I look at and where I look at it. In the social sciences, it's much lower in 1990 than it would be elsewhere. But I will look for translations and collaborations and textbooks. I think it's an important source. I've done some of that, but not enough. About the archives, it varies very strongly. So I've been looking at American documents because I'm here, but also American documents are basically open until 1996, and then they stop because there was a 25-year rule. So I can see everything from the early 90s and much less from later. That's the state archives. Some of the private archives are open a little bit later than that, but I'm usually restricted by privacy rules to how recent I can go, which means that the character of my research up until 2000 is much richer and has much more behind the scenes context and is much weaker later. In the case of Russia, the Academy of Sciences documentation is actually pretty good across the 90s because the structure exists to do that. And it is still continuous. The structure is there, whereas the GDR vanishes, so the structure is not there. So for the Russian case, it's actually pretty good. What I haven't done yet, and I would really like to do, is look at what happens to Czechoslovakia as it moves across 89 and then as it breaks apart, and see what happens to those countries as they change, and especially what tracks that leaves and how data is gathered. The data is actually very problematic. So the archives are limited. Much of the information is this very bad quantitative data that I don't know how to get away from. And interviews are very problematic. And the main reason I'm worried about interviews is I would like to get information from people about the 1990s, but I don't want them to know about Vladimir Vladimirovich. I want them to not know what happens to Russia in the 21st century. And to some degree, I have that because they were interviewed in the 1990s and people traveled in the 1990s and wrote reports about what they saw. So I have some information, but I would like to know, not that I want to know what happens under Putin, but I want to know people's views about what Russian science was like when they don't yet know that Skolkovo is going to happen. And that's very hard to capture, this moment of ignorance before the future, especially with work that is so recent. And most of the documentation that does exist is in people's personal papers. So they haven't yet given them to an archive. They're just in their house. So I sometimes get access to that material, and sometimes I get good interview information, but otherwise it's very hard. So the evidence question is very difficult. You would think something so recent would be much easier, but in many ways it's much harder because the tools that we are trained on to do history don't work. Especially when people don't have personal letters that they write anymore. They send emails and then everything is destroyed. So the emails are basically vanished, and I have a very hard time reconstructing some of the things that would be much easier to do in the 1970s, or obviously earlier. But thank you very much. These are all excellent questions.